You mentioned that that someone had talked about needing to establish the conflict by page 3. So in thinking about that sort of 22-page space that we have to work with in this economy of space that you're dealing with, are there these rules of thumb that in general when you're teaching your classes that both of you sort of go by in terms of here's kind of when you should be getting to this, here's kind of when we should be moving to this, and when do you sort of head down the home stretch? Is there a formula kind of that you throw out there?
We don't like to use the word formula. I don't do that. I like
Sure.
Suggestions, recipes. I mean, formula
Sure.
indicates formula. There should be something at stake that should be introduced reasonably early that the story's about.
Yeah, I explain it the way Robert McKee, who teaches a course in screenwriting, I took it with Archie Goodwin. It's like writer's boot camp, 3 very intensive days on structure.
I think it's expanded to 4. I'm not sure what he does. I think it's expanded to 4 days. So
Well, I'm old, Dan.
I took it to the 3 days.
But there's stuff that has worked for most people most of the time. There are no rules, as McKee says, there are principles. Generally, the faster you can get your characters talking, the better it is, because in one of Tom Wolfe's books, he cites a study done, I use this as a joke with Mary Fran, but it really was done at Stanford this time, that showed that dialogue is the fastest way to engage a reader's attention. So even if you're writing a nonfiction article, I always try and get a quote into the second paragraph. And this business of establishing conflict, yeah, your story doesn't really begin until your focused character, your hero, is enmeshed in a problem. And that doesn't happen until you present them with a conflict. So one of the best books, I probably got it here, Save the Cat by Blake Snyder on screenplay writing, says that that should be established no later than 11 pages into the script. I had a student a couple of semesters ago who took Snyder's outline and then shrunk it down mathematically to comic book pages, which was a pretty neat thing for her to do. And if that made the process of writing more comfortable for her, it was a good thing. Or that individual might not work for everybody.
And then ideally you want the conflict to escalate and go to higher and higher levels of stress and conflict.
Rising action,
Yes.
the magic act paradigm. If you've ever seen a good magic show, the great Wizzo starts off, takes the stage, and does something spectacular. His gloves turn into a pair of doves. And then he does a card trick, and then each trick that he does is more baffling than the previous trick, and the last 5 minutes of the show he makes the elephant disappear, and you are stunned, and you walk out of there wondering, how did he do that? You can think stories the same way. You get their attention as quickly as you can, especially if you're writing a 22-page comic book, because you don't have all that much space to waste. And then every encounter that the hero has with his problem or with the villain or both, the stakes are higher. Every fight is a little bit harder. They start off fist fighting in an alley and they end up fist fighting on top of a skyscraper during a thunderstorm.
With Aunt May tied up.
Yeah, with Aunt May
tied up.
And Peter Parker putting the camera up or taking pictures. That's a very good way to think. Also, you're not always going to be, if you're a professional and you have Danny's twins to feed, you're not always going to be inspired. So you have to have, I started thinking about technique when I realized I had one of those snotty little things that soils up baby, yeah. And that kid kept insisting on food, and at the time working for Charlotte at $4 a page, I was not going to be inspired 6 times a month. So I tried to think what can I do with my left brain, the part that's logical, to guarantee that I won't ever write something that isn't publishable. That was my only goal. And that's one of the reasons that you pay attention to things like rising action. Because rising action, if you do it well, guarantees that you're not going to lose your readers. They'll need to know what happens next.
Then you pay off on the rising action, and then in the last count of the last page, oh no, not you. And
You turn the page and it's Dr. Doom. It's been Dr. Doom.
you'll find out the next, right. Either you find out on the last page, or you don't even know who, but either you have to turn the page or buy the next issue.
Which, by the way, is, I don't know how it works in the context of those Marvel comics, but it's pretty crappy storytelling technique. You save your big moment for the last page. Not a good idea, usually.
Well, you want to pay off on what you set up in that issue.
Exactly.
But then have something that will bring.
Even if you're writing a serialized story, and that's most stories these days, every issue or every chapter or every episode has to move it along toward the end, which means you must know what the end is before you start writing. But you have to keep it moving. Another guy who teaches screenwriting, John Truby, says you never visit your characters. Let's look in and see how the Fantastic Four is having breakfast this morning. Oh, they're out on the patio. And Mr. Fantastic is having scrambled eggs. And then you go back to some other part of New York City. No, you don't show them having breakfast unless Dr. Doom put poison in the unless it's going to have something to do with the story. That is another beginner's mistake. I once worked with a guy who was a newbie, and he had actually published a Spider-Man story, and on page 2 there was something really interesting. Peter Parker finds a Spider-Man guy dead in an alley. Well, yeah, that's a good story hook. And nothing, he doesn't refer to it for the next 21 pages. We just kind of follow Pete through his day. This implies that you have to know what story you're telling, and that you don't ever have something in there unless you can say, either this is the best joke I've ever thought of, even if it doesn't have something to do with the story, or it moves the story along. And if you do that, there's something called profluence. It's one of those English class words. Stephen King has it. It's very hard to stop reading a Stephen King novel once he has you hooked. The kind of structural consideration I'm talking about practically guarantees profluence. It is a technique that serves, it's not a technique for its own sake, it's a technique to help you tell your story as effectively as possible.
I got nothing.
Well, there you go. As we sort of wrap up here, because unfortunately our time is ending, I've put up here, Danny, your website and your Twitter here. Denny, I know that you write over at Comic Mix. Is there any other places online that you would like people to find you?
Regularly, yeah, Comic Mix every Thursday morning, unless I've had a really bad week. No, I have always managed to make the deadlines because I am a very good little boy. I'm a good little writer.
Well, we thank you both for the time that you Thanks to everybody for coming and making your questions. Danny Fingeroth, Denny O'Neill, doesn't get any better than that. No. Great way to wrap up ComiCON. You have an hour left to go and buy your comics and stop by both of these gentlemen's tables and pick up some great stuff. So thanks for moderating. Oh, thank you. Good job.